All right. Hi. Good morning, everyone. I'm Thomas. I'm a PhD candidate at KU Leuven and a researcher at DNS Belgium, the registry of the .be top-level domain. And together with researchers from other universities and registries, we worked on a large-scale study to characterize phishing websites in the sense of like, what do they look like, what is their life cycle, and how are they mitigated. Our findings have been presented in a paper at a Computer and Communication Security Conference this month, and today I'm also going to present the results here. So we think that phishing is a major threat on the internet because it has been identified by several security organizations as one of the most important security threats. So that's why we decided to do research on this. And phishing is also big business because there have been instances of so-called phishing as a service providers, which basically means that, say you are a criminal and you want to launch phishing attacks, well, all you need to do is pay them a couple $100 per month, and they will provide you with hosting infrastructure, website templates, and so on, which makes it a lot more accessible for groups of criminals to do phishing. So the takeaway there is that we have large groups of criminals scamming many vulnerable people. Now, our study is the first that brings together 3 country code top-level domain registries to work on this topic. Specifically, we worked with the Netherlands.nl, Ireland's.ie, and Belgium's.be. We managed to do the study over quite a long period of time, being 10 years. And the advantage of having the ccTLD registry point of view is that we have a complete view over our domain name zones. And because there are 3 of us, we can also compare the results and see if there are similarities and differences between us. Our study is of a larger scale than most earlier work on phishing tends to be in terms of time, because we investigate 4 to 10 years of data, while many other studies are limited to 1 year. Also, in terms of the companies that are being impersonated that we found, we have more than 1,000, and also the number of phishing domains in our data set, which is almost 30,000. So there are considerable differences between the 3 top-level domains, which are important to keep in mind when interpreting the results. First, there is the size. .nl is by far the largest, with about 6 million domain names in their zone, and .ie is the smallest, with 330,000. .be is in between that, with 1.7 million domain names. And second, a notable point is that everyone is free to register a .nl or a .be domain name. But for .ie, it is limited to people or entities with a connection to Ireland. And you have to prove this if you want to register a .ie domain name. This is manually verified before you get the domain. So as registries, we know about all the domains we have in our zone, but we still need to know which domains had phishing on them. And for that, we are all subscribed to the blocklist services of Netcraft, which provides us with the data we need. Specifically, in this data set, we have on which domain names phishing was found, but also the exact URL, the timestamp on which it was found, and the company that the phishing website tries to impersonate. And we can use this data set in conjunction with the private data sets we have at our registry, which is the registration database with all the information about the registered domain, and also measurements at the web and the DNS level. Here's a first plot which shows the total number of phishing domains per month for all 3 TLDs over time. We counted unique second-level domains, and for clarity, a second-level domain is a domain directly below the top-level domain, like example.be, B1. And we see that across all the TLDs, there is a slight decrease over time in the number of phishing domains. So phishing tries to deceive users by mimicking companies that they are familiar with. And let's take a look at the characteristics of those impersonated companies. A first point is that citizens tend to have trust in their country code top-level domain because it's used by governments and also by companies they are familiar with. So a question is, do attackers also exploit this trust for phishing? And we see on the chart here, which makes a distinction between international and local phishing. By international phishing, I mean that the impersonated company is headquartered in another country than the one associated with TLD, and local phishing that the company is within the country. And we see that most phishing is international, like this is the purple bar. It's a lot bigger than the local phishing, which seems to indicate that attackers don't really care about the TLD they use. But is that really the case? If we look at the domain names that did international phishing and local phishing separately, then we see a clear pattern, which is that international companies tend to be impersonated with domains that are years old. And national companies are impersonated with domains that are most of the time only a couple of days old. By age of the domain, what I mean specifically is the time between the registration, which we know as the registry, and the time that it was detected, which is in our Netcraft dataset. So this seems to indicate two attack strategies, which is that national companies are targeted using new domain names and international companies using old domain names. The ratio of this is that about 1/5 of the phishing domain names are new domains. But that's a rough number because for .nl it's a bit higher, for .be it's a bit lower. Now, why do we have this difference? The difference lies in how the attackers obtain the domain names. For the old domains, what happens most of the time is that those domain names are owned by legitimate people or businesses, and they have a website associated with it that can be exploited using security vulnerabilities. And that's what the attackers do. They scan for such domain names, they exploit them, and they host phishing on it. In contrast, the new domain names are maliciously registered. They are registered by the phishers themselves. And we see that those old compromised domains tend to be used for the international phishing attacks, and the maliciously registered domains for local phishing attacks. We do not only see this on .nl, we also see this on .be, where if it's a new .be domain, it usually targets a Belgian company. So the usage of maliciously registered domains allows the attacker to better mimic the company they want to target because they have control over the domain name. So they can choose names like activate credit cards, online verification, or names that look very closely like the bank they're targeting, for example. We've also seen that those domain names are sometimes chosen in Dutch, which also emphasizes the point that these tend to be used by local attackers. But registering the domain name yourself, that imposes a cost because they need to pay for the registration, and they also need to set up the hosting infrastructure. While in contrast, the compromised domain names, in that case, the attackers don't have control over the domain name. They just take whatever they can get. But there is no cost associated with the registration because they don't make the registration themselves. They parasitize on a registration that was done by someone else a long time ago. Here's an overview of the top 10 of companies that are impersonated in the .nl zone. We see that Microsoft tops the list. It's a very popular target for phishing. We also see that on .be and .ai. And we see that in this case, it's a nice mix of international and local companies. And this table also highlights the difference between the international and local phishing, because the international companies, they all have, the domains all have median ages of over 1,000, while the local, the domain names targeting the local companies, they have a median age of 1 or 2 days. And we see that in this case, the local companies are all banks, which is also true that in general, banks and financial services are very popular targets across all the TLDs we looked at, alongside sectors like technology or internet services. Those are very popular as well. Now, I've only talked about .nl and .be in the context of this comparison between compromised and maliciously registered. But what about .ai? Well, we've only found 2 new phishing domains on .ai, which makes sense because of the restricted registration policy I mentioned earlier. This policy puts up a very high barrier for attackers to register .ai names, because they would have to prove who they are and why they're connected to Ireland, and that's not easy. There has been a case of attackers using fake IDs to register a bunch of .ai domain names, but this is not very common. It's a lot more difficult than just registering a domain name that you are completely free to register. But this policy of .ai does not prevent against compromised domain names, because, as mentioned before, the compromise is not related to the domain registration itself. Let's take a look at how the companies overlap between the different TLDs. Overall, we have found more than 1,000 targeted companies in our dataset, of which 193 appear in all 3 TLDs. And these are all the big, well-known global companies such as Microsoft and Apple. There's also a high overlap between .nl and .be, specifically 247 companies, which is a result that makes sense because there are several ties between Belgium and the Netherlands, such as the fact that they share a language, or that many banks operate in both countries. We've also seen domain names where both Belgian and Dutch companies are targeted on the same domain name. So, well, that also makes sense. And the other numbers mostly seem to be decided by the attack surface, because .nl has a larger domain name space with 6 million domains. There is more potential for domain names to be compromised. And for .nl, we also have 10 years of data, while for .ie and .be, we only have 4 years of data. So it also translates in finding more unique companies on .nl. Let's take a look at the lifecycle and mitigation of the phishing websites. One way to look at the activity is by measuring the DNS traffic at the authoritative DNS server from the registry. And here's an example of a maliciously registered domain name. We see that shortly after the registration, the traffic spikes. And this is when the phishing campaign is launched by the attackers. Shortly after it is detected, notification is sent out, after which the activity just tends to decline, and except for some peaks, and then it is mitigated at the DNS level. Another example is a compromised domain name. This domain name belonged to a legitimate company that which got hacked, and the phishers, they put up a phishing website on it. In that case, we see that the activity is steady and rather low until the moment when the attackers launch their campaign, and then a big spike happens. And later on, the domain gets mitigated by the hosting provider. So the domain name stays with the original registrant, and the website could continue operating. So the fact that I mentioned at the first example that the mitigation happened at the DNS level, and in the second case that it was done by the hosting provider, indicates that phishing mitigation is not just one single event carried out by one single party, because there are many different parties involved that can mitigate the phishing website independently. Say at the DNS level, if you register a domain name, you don't purchase it from the registry directly, but you make use of a registrar. So at the DNS level, both the registry and the registrar could take down the domain. And it's also possible that you have a name server provider that is not the registrar, which could be another party that can do the mitigation. And at the web level, there is the hosting provider that could take down the websites and make it inaccessible for visitors. The names on the slide are examples. It could be a different situation for any other domain, except for the registry, of course, because each TLD has their proper registry. If a registry takes action, they have the choice between different ways to do so. They can either suspend the domain, which means that they take it out of their zone file, but it stays in their namespace, or they can delete the domain altogether, even from the namespace, or they can keep the domain both in their zone and in the namespace, but change the name servers so that visitors are pointed to a safe location. And which action is taken by the registry and at what moment they do so, that differs between registries because, well, they have their own policies, and a summary of these policies is given on the slide. Well, not at the moment. There it is. So a summary of these policies, is on the slides. There is quite some difference between the registries, and that will also show in the results of how those domains are mitigated, which we also looked at. Here's for the new domains, the mitigation specifically at the DNS level. We see that we look at the difference between who mitigates domain names. Is it the registry or the registrar? And we see that for .nl, by far, most of the mitigation is done by the registrar. And that's because .nl notifies the registrars and the hosting providers who then take action. .be suspends a lot more domain names themselves. They also notify the other parties, but they take action themselves as well. The bars here don't fill up to 100% because this only shows mitigation at the DNS level. The rest of the domains is mitigated at the web level by the hosting provider. So this is for the new domains, which are mostly maliciously registered. For the old domains, we see that there is a lot less mitigation at the DNS level overall. And that's because these domains tend to be compromised, so mitigation at the web level is preferred, so that the legitimate operations of the websites that it originally was on, that's not impaired too badly. An exception is when phishers register a domain, leave it hanging for some time, and then host a phishing attack on it, which is referred to as aged domains. We can also measure how fast DNS mitigation and web mitigation are compared to each other, because for .nl and .ie, our Netcraft dataset also has the timestamp of mitigation, which is the moment when the first action happened that rendered the phishing website inaccessible. So we can compare this with the DNS mitigation as seen from the registry point of view. And what we see is that within a day at the DNS level, about 50 to 60% of the domains is mitigated at DNS level. But if we look at the same percentage at the web level, then this is already reached after 6 hours, which means that web mitigation is generally faster than DNS mitigation. Here's a case study of phishing against a French bank from a .nl domain name. This screenshot was taken by the in-house crawler of .nl, and this crawler tries to visit new domains every couple hours when it's newly registered. So we have several measurements of these websites, and based on that, we can reconstruct the timeline of these websites. That's shown on this chart. All the stars at the bottom is a moment when the crawler visited the website and took a snapshot. The red line is when it was mitigated. So what we can reconstruct from the crawler data is that before the mitigation, the crawler has seen the phishing website, which is what the screenshot was from. And then it was mitigated by the hosting provider, after which it was unreachable for a couple hours, and then replaced by the default web page of the hosting provider. What we can also learn from this graph is that even before the notification, which is a gray line, the crawler had already visited the phishing websites. And this was analyzed after the fact and was not known at the time. But it shows that in some cases, the position of the registry who knows about all domain names could be leveraged to reduce the detection time of the phishing websites. Although, of course, this will not help in all instances because like the crawler can only try to visit the homepage. If the phishing website is hidden behind some deeper URL structure, then the crawler cannot know about it. But in some cases, it may be an opportunity to detect the websites earlier if it could be automatically done so at the crawler. So to compare the two attack strategies, we have the new domains that make up about 1/5 of all phishing domains, and they target a small share of the companies by leveraging the trust in the ccTLD, and a restricted registration policy inhibits those registrations. Mitigation happens at both the DNS and the web level. In contrast, the alt domains make up most domain names, and they also target the highest number of companies. And restricted registration does not help with them. And mitigation happens mostly at the web level. What we found is that most research on phishing is on new domain names, but we have seen that most phishing takes place on compromised domains. So we believe that it would be helpful if more research is done on compromised domain names in order to detect them faster. We also think it's a good idea for ccTLD registries to take a look at their registration and abuse policies, because as we have seen, a policy can make a big difference in how the domain is mitigated. So to wrap up the presentation, I'll give a quick summary. So we collaborated with 3 European country code top-level domain registries on the largest phishing characterization study, in which we found 2 main attacker types. We have the national companies that are targeted using new maliciously registered domain names, and the international companies that are targeted using old compromised domain names. The policy has a big impact on the mitigation, because we see that .ie has almost no maliciously registered domain names, and between .be and .nl, DNS mitigation differs in who performs the mitigation, the registry or the registrar. Finally, we believe that having more research done on compromised domain names would be good. If you're interested in reading the full paper, you can visit the URL or scan the QR code, and I'm happy to take any questions.